Ahoy hoy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Canadian No Sides. Today I'm just going to be talking about a game I like to play called Hearts of Iron 4. And basically I'm just going to be going over things I'd like to see improved. And this video is going to just cover quality of life improvements. I am going to do a video where it's going to cover improvements I'd like to see to democratic nations, improvements I'd like to see to the Soviet Civil War, and improvements I'd like to see in terms of the intelligence agencies, which is going to need a huge freaking overhaul. If you don't know anything about Hearts of Iron 4, there's some other channels you can watch. Feedback Gaming, ISO Productions does achievement hunting. There is Alex the Rambler. He likes to play the game. And then there's Boko1. He does a bunch of fun multiplayer games. Anyway, those are just minor shoutouts. Anyway, yeah, I'm just going to get into it. One of the first changes I'd like to see is to the supply depot system. Now, I actually like the supply depot system. It was implemented, I believe, in the No Step Back DLC, which is the DLC I came in on. And it's very useful. It does have some drawbacks, though, where it takes a very long time in order to build a supply depot. However, I don't actually want to reduce the amount of time it takes to build a supply depot. What I would like is for supply depots to give gradual increases in supply. So, because you're not going to wait until the entire thing's built in order to start using it, but you're also not going to start using it the moment the shovel goes in the ground, right? So what I would suggest is after about 20% completion, you get about 20% of the supply. After 40% of the completion, you get about 40% supply, 60%, 60% supply, etc., etc. I think that would be a good balance in terms of not stalling your advance and reducing attrition rates. Now, this is in the Soviet tree. Now, there is another small issue that I'd like to address before I move on, and that is focuses that require research in order to complete. Now, if it's just one focus off to the side, I don't mind it so much, but when it blocks other focuses down the tree, that's when I get annoyed. Now, this is the Soviet focus tree, but as you can see here, you have to take improved medium tank chassis in order to get Soviet artillery, which means you can't go light tanks, you can't go heavy tanks, and you can't just focus on artillery. You actually have, in order to get the benefit of Soviet artillery, you have to go medium tanks. And you don't get many research slots as the Soviets, obviously. Anyway, that's just a minor nitpick that I have that I'd like to see improved. Another improvement I'd like to see is in terms of shipbuilding. Capital ships. There is no meta in the game currently where anyone efficiently or effectively recommends building capital ships because they take too bloody long. They take years to build from scratch. This is already mostly completed, but they take years to build from scratch, and you can build several light cruisers in that time because you can attach 10 dockyards to them instead of just 5. Now, I know this was done as a balancing mechanic to ensure that major nations didn't just outpace small nations. However, there are ways of helping smaller nations catch up. And there's actually an example of this in the Italian focus tree, where you can refit civilian ships. Now, this is just for aircraft carriers, but having that for smaller nations, which I actually think they're doing to a certain extent in the new DLC for Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, but I do think that it should be expanded to all the smaller nations that would help speed up their naval production. And if they had specific focuses in order to help them build capital ships, then you wouldn't need this limitation. And if you don't have that limitation, people are actually going to start utilizing that aspect of the game. Now I have a couple of small nitpicks that are fixed by other areas in the game. So the first one I'm going to start with is the airfields. Now in terms of airfields, your allies can use your airfields without your permission. This means that the planes you want to use in an airspace can't because your allies are using it with their shitty planes when you want to put your better planes in. And this becomes a problem when you're actually trying to control an airspace. Now this can be solved by another aspect of the game, because in the supply situation, you can actually stop your allies from utilizing your supply depots so that your supply is used by your troops. If you had the same system with the airfields, where you could stop your allies from taking up space in your airfields, that would be very beneficial. Now the other small nitpick that I had that can be solved by other aspects of the game is in terms of equipment deficits for armies. Now, some armies can be more important than others depending on what front they're using and what military leaders they have. Now, what you can do in the air wings is prioritize which air wings get the newest equipment. What I would like to see is something similar with the army, where you could prioritize which armies got the newest equipment. That way you can get your newest equipment to, say, special forces teams or to more important fronts. That way you could avoid your newest equipment being diluted across all your military forces. Jumping now to a very minor nitpick that I just threw in the middle here is newspaper clippings. I'd like to see more personalized newspaper clippings where it reflects what troops you used in order to take what victory points and what actually happened on the ground. I know it's a minor thing, but it just helps immersion and it's fun, right? It's fun when you take Berlin or Moscow and the newspaper clippings come up, or when you take Stalingrad and it tells a story. But if it's telling a story that's not exactly reflective of what's actually happening, then it can break immersion a little bit. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. Something else that I would like to see is, in order to help smaller nations, when determining war participation, I think that casualty rates should have a greater impact on the overall percentage of war participation, because it would help, say, if a smaller nation got a nuke and or a lot of encirclements and actually started turning the tide of the war. So I know occupation definitely helps, but in terms of war participation, if your country, say Romania or Yugoslavia, has more war participation or has caused more casualties during the entire war than other nations, I think that should definitely count a lot more towards the percentage they get at the end of the war. Another nitpick that I have is it's small, but in terms of promoting your generals to field marshals, etc., I think that the more skilled they are, the more medals they have, etc., it should be easier and cost less in order to promote them, because it would require less capital and less convincing. Oh, that guy's becoming a field marshal? Well, yes, he is incredibly skilled in X, Y, and Z. I think that I know they have it in terms of being politically connected and career officers, but I think competence should also provide a reduction in the cost to promote. Anyway, just another small nitpick. Now for another aspect of the game that I think needs tweaking is rocket sites. because nobody uses rocket sites because they're too small in terms of their range. You can't move them, and they take up a building slot. Not only that, but you can't determine their placement inside of a province. Now, I understand that you'd want to have a limit in terms of how many you can build in a province, but they do that with airports and anti-aircraft. You can do that with missile sites. But also being able to place it inside parts of a province so that you could have the largest area in terms of coverage would actually make them somewhat viable, because as far as I know, no one uses them. And what I'd also like to see in terms of research for rockets is the ability to move them so that they can advance with your army. Now, what you could have is the ability to research special forces divisions that would have, say, ICBM trucks that you could move around, and maybe after you research nukes, you could move ICBM nuke trucks around, where you don't need air superiority in order to launch nukes. Now, maybe if that division takes a certain amount of damage, there's a chance that the nuke explodes, goes boom, destroys the division, and, causes the same damage as a nuke going off in a territory. I think that would add another fun dynamic to the gameplay and would make disaster saves a lot more fun and interesting. Now, of course, it would be a late tech. Like, you can put it down here. But it is something that I think that when you add it to the game, would add another dimension to the game. Especially if you could speed up research by, say, using political power in order to focus on a specific research and reduce the amount of time it takes. Something like that, where you could essentially rush this in order to make multiplayer games, etc., more dynamic. I'm probably going to go over this in another video that I'm going to do that will include like wonder weapons and stuff like that. But it's just something that I think, even if they just addressed the issue with the rocket sites, I think that would definitely be a quality of life improvement. Another quality of life improvement is paratroopers. It's an exploit that it makes it too easy to capitulate any country, especially small countries that only have a couple of victory points like Hungary, where you take Budapest and Pécs and you're basically capitulated. In order to avoid this scenario, what I would do is I would ensure that you would have to hold victory points for a week in order for the country to capitulate. That way that it's still going to screw up the lines, and the enemy is going to rush back to their victory points in order to secure them. But I think that would avoid that particular exploit, which is ridiculously easy. Now you could have spirits so that, say, Denmark, which capitulated very quickly in terms of getting their victory points capitulated, that's something that more reflects reality, so they could have a spirit that allows for that type of gameplay. But in terms of just having it so that the moment you take a victory point, it immediately capitulates the country, I think moving the deadline from 24 hours to a week, I think would definitely limit that exploitability. Now, in terms of extending that deadline from 24 hours to a week, I think that would remove or at least limit that exploit. Now let's actually talk about the balance of power, because I do like the balance of power mechanic. I do like the concentrated power versus dispersed, but the problem I have with it is they connected the Civil War to the balance of power. And that I really don't like, because civil wars should be triggered by stability and losing core territory. If you lose a certain percentage of core territory and you have, say, 20% stability, then maybe you get a civil war. Actually, ideally, it should be 0% stability and then the civil war triggers, but you could have Italy maybe trigger at 20%, but tying the civil war to stability, I think, would be a much better change, because having the balance of power having the balance of power so that you try and focus on concentrating power rather than having a balance between dispersing power and a balance of power is an issue. Now, I don't mind the bonuses, like the political power gain, as well as the detriment to Army, Navy, and air experience. That, I think, is good. They could probably bump up the political power gain, in my opinion, to 20 or 25%, just because I think that there should be more things that cost political power, and it makes sense to have political power be under the concentrated balance of power. What I would like to see under the dispersed balance of power is what they had originally, which is a bonus to air, naval, and military XP, as well as I would have an increase in the cap and growth of your command power, because you're delegating responsibilities, right? You don't have people in those delegated positions, constantly looking over their shoulder. So they would have more agency in order to carry out their tasks. I would not have a penalty to war support or stability, because you're just delegating amongst a group of people, right? It shouldn't have a detrimental impact to stability to have a broader range of power. I do agree with the bonuses to stability and war support for concentrated power, because there's a dear leader and the only information people are getting is filtered through that one focal point. Everything's going well, don't worry, blah blah blah. But in terms of having penalties to stability and war support, I don't think so. I also think there should be a bonus to intel gain, a greater chance of your spy missions succeeding, as well as being able to capture enemy spies easier. And I would have the reverse in terms of concentrated power, where you'd have slower intel gain, your spies would get captured easier, and you would have a harder time capturing enemy spies. But I'm also going to do a good portion of a video on an entire overhaul of what I think the intelligence agencies in the game need, because oh my goodness, there's a lot of issues. Now another small issue that I have that I'd like to see fixed is front lines. When troops move around the front line, they immediately start moving the moment they get the command order. They do not wait for a reinforcing division. And that's very problematic if you're, say, adding an army to a front, or if you need to move troops around, where it can leave entire sections of the front open for the enemy to walk into. Now, what I would like to see is, say, a button up here where you can choose 0, 1, 2, or 3 in terms of how many divisions the army should wait for reinforcements before moving troops away from that territory, before moving troops down the front line. This way you might not have gaps or holes in your line unless you're pushed past a breaking point, and then of course you can alter how many divisions are waiting. But in terms of frontline adjustments, it would make a hell of a lot better if divisions waited for reinforcements before they finished their move order, or before they started their move order. Similarly, I think last stands and force attacks should only apply to selected divisions, because currently it goes down the entire army, which is very expensive. You usually don't need to use a last stand on your entire army, and you usually don't need to use force attack on your entire army, because these are positional tools. You usually use them in order to take a supply hub or defend an airfield or something important. But it's usually not your entire army that you want to use these on. So I think it should be adjusted just so that it only applies to the selected units. Alright. Another small nitpick that I have is events and decisions. There are too many that you need to scroll down to get. I think that events and decisions should be split up into 3 different buttons. So you'd have 2 extra buttons up here for events and decisions. One button would apply only to political actions, one would apply to military actions, and then you'd have one for everything else. And that way you can limit the amount of scrolling you need to do in order to find what you need. I mean, you can up and close tabs, but doing that all the time is just annoying because sometimes you need what's in that tab, right? So it would save a lot on clicking and scrolling in order to find what you need. And now we're going to move on to special forces. You have to research your special forces, and you don't usually do these because you don't necessarily need mountaineers for very much of the game, and you don't necessarily need Marines for much of the game, and you might not need paratroopers for much of the game. And having an entire research tree just to try and improve special forces that are only sometimes used in specific circumstances is a waste of a research slot. And it's a waste of a research slot for a long ass time. So what I'd actually like to see is this entire section here moved into a doctrine tree. So they'd have their own staff officer, they'd have their own spirits, and they'd have their own doctrine tree. So you could have Special Forces tab, and you could have Mountaineers, you could have Paratroopers, and you could have Marines, all split into this section. And then the more you use them, right, you get a counter up here, and the more you use them, the more effective and efficient they'll be. And it would actually encourage people to use special forces because they get better as the war goes on. Now, I'm also going to do a bit of a hot take. I'm going to do a bit of a hot take here and say that support companies should also be part of a doctrine tree. So they'd have their own staff officer, they'd have their own spirits, and they'd have their own doctrine tree. Now, the doctrine tree would look probably a lot like this, but where it would just be straight unless they want to get real creative with it. But I think that having a doctrine tree for your support companies, which would get another counter based on the amount of support companies that you have equipped and how active those specific divisions are. And I think it would make developing your support companies much more interesting, so that the more you utilize your support companies, the better they get, rather than having to waste research slots on support companies. And the last thing I want to talk about is the medal system. I like the idea of the medal system, but currently it's split up with different medals being awarded based on different countries. And the bonuses are specific to those countries. I would like to change that so that it's based on the division's actions. So a medal that a division would get would be, say, if they took a victory point with a battle, not just walked into it, but took a victory point with a battle, then they would get a medal that would increase that division's urban combat fighting ability. Or say if they constantly defended against a numerically superior force, then they would get a medal that would increase their HP. Or if, say, they won so many battles in a hot climate, then they'd get a medal that reduced penalties to that hot climate. So I think the medal system should be based on the actions of the division, not something that's specific to the country itself. So that, I think, would make the gameplay more dynamic, and it would encourage you to put certain divisions in certain armies or in certain areas so that they could achieve specific medals. Anyway, these are some of my quality of life improvements that I'd like to see in Hearts of Iron 4. Now, if you like the video, like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments on what you'd like to see in terms of quality of life improvements, or if you have any comments you'd like to make on what I think should be improved in terms of gameplay, then put them in the comments below. Until next time, ciao to ya.